Hey, beautiful souls, welcome back to Soul Stories. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to join our family. Stay with us, because a new love story is about to begin. The moment Clara Josephine Weatherby stepped off the stagecoach in the dusty frontier town of Copper Springs, she knew her life would never be the same. The year was 1873. And the Arizona Territory stretched before her like an endless canvas of red earth and blue sky. She clutched her worn leather satchel containing everything she owned in this world, which amounted to 3 dresses, a collection of pressed wildflowers, and a leather-bound journal filled with sketches of birds she had observed throughout her 24 years of life. Clara was not like other women of her time, and she had known this since childhood. While other girls learned needlepoint and dreamed of marriage, Clara spent her days climbing trees to observe hawk nests and wading through streams to study the movements of fish. Her father, a naturalist who had taught at a small college in Massachusetts, encouraged her unusual interests until his death 3 years prior. Her mother had passed when Clara was just 7, leaving her father as her only ally in a world that did not understand a woman who preferred field guides to fashion plates. After her father died, Clara found herself alone with no fortune and no prospects. Her aunt offered her a home but made it clear that Clara would need to abandon her peculiar habits and focus on finding a suitable husband. Clara endured 2 miserable years of embroidery lessons and afternoon teas before she saw the advertisement in a Boston newspaper. A territorial school in Arizona needed a teacher willing to instruct children of all ages in reading, writing, and arithmetic. The salary was modest, but included a small cottage and the freedom Clara desperately craved. Now she stood in the middle of a town that looked nothing like the illustrations she had seen in magazines. The buildings were rough wooden structures bleached pale by the relentless sun. A general store occupied one corner, while a saloon dominated another. Horses stood tied to posts along the main street, and men in wide-brimmed hats moved about their business with purposeful strides. Women were scarce, and those Clara spotted wore practical calico dresses and expressions of weary determination. A man approached her with a friendly nod. He was tall and weathered with gray streaking his dark hair and deep lines carved around his eyes from years of squinting against the desert sun. He introduced himself as Henry Blackwood, the mayor of Copper Springs and the man who had placed the advertisement she answered. He welcomed her to town and explained that the schoolhouse was just up the road. Her cottage sat behind it, small but sturdy with a good roof and a fireplace that would keep her warm during the cold desert nights. Clara thanked him and gathered her belongings. As she walked toward her new home, she noticed a group of children watching her from behind a water trough. Their faces showed a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. She smiled at them and continued walking, knowing she would meet them properly soon enough. The cottage was exactly as Henry had described. One room served as both living space and bedroom with a small kitchen area in the corner. A narrow bed sat against one wall, and a wooden table with 2 chairs occupied the center of the room. The fireplace was clean and ready for use. Clara set down her satchel and stood in the middle of her new home, breathing deeply for the first time in years. She was free. The schoolhouse needed work before classes could begin. Clara spent her first week sweeping floors, washing windows, and arranging the mismatched collection of desks that had been donated by various families. She discovered that the previous teacher had left suddenly after only 3 months, unable to handle the isolation and the challenging students. The town had been without formal education for nearly a year. On her second day in Copper Springs, Clara encountered the person who would change everything she thought she knew about herself and about love. She had risen early to explore the landscape around her new home, hoping to spot some of the desert birds she had read about in her father's books. She walked beyond the edge of town where the scrubland gave way to rocky outcroppings and clusters of saguaro cactuses that stood like silent sentinels against the morning sky. She heard the sound before she saw its source. Someone was singing in a language she did not recognize, the melody haunting and beautiful in the still morning air. Clara followed the sound until she came upon a small clearing where a woman knelt beside a cooking fire. The woman looked up as Clara approached and their eyes met across the dancing flames. Her name was Winona, and she was a widow from the Yavapai people who lived in the territory. She had married a white trader who died of fever 2 years earlier, leaving her caught between two worlds. The white settlers did not fully accept her, and returning to her people had become complicated by circumstances Clara would come to understand only later. Winona lived in a small cabin on the outskirts of town, surviving by selling handmade baskets and doing laundry for the miners who worked the copper deposits in the nearby hills. Clara should have been frightened or at least cautious. Everything she had been taught told her to keep her distance from someone so different from herself. But something in Winona's dark eyes called to her, something familiar that she could not name. Clara asked about the song Winona had been singing, and Winona explained it was a morning prayer, a way of greeting the sun and asking for guidance through the day ahead. That first meeting led to another, and then another. Clara began rising early each morning to walk to the clearing where Winona prepared her breakfast. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories of their lives and their losses. Winona taught Clara the names of the desert plants, and which ones could heal and which ones could harm. Clara showed Winona her sketches of birds and explained the scientific names her father had taught her. They laughed at how different their knowledge was and how perfectly it fit together. The children of Copper Springs proved to be as challenging as the previous teacher had warned. They ranged in age from 6 to 16, and most had never sat in a proper classroom before. The boys were rowdy, and the girls were shy, and all of them tested Clara's patience in ways she had never imagined. But she discovered that she had a gift for teaching. She made lessons into games and used the natural world around them as her textbook. She took the children on walks to identify plants and track animals. She taught them arithmetic by counting the spots on beetles and measuring the heights of cactuses. Slowly they began to trust her and to learn. Her friendship with Winona deepened as the months passed. Clara found herself counting the hours until she could escape to the clearing or to Winona's small cabin. They cooked meals together and walked the desert trails together and sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the distant mountains. Clara had never felt so understood by another person, not even by her beloved father. Winona seemed to see past all the walls Clara had built around herself and to accept what she found there without judgment. It was Winona who first named what was growing between them. They were sitting beside a small stream watching the water catch the afternoon light when Winona reached over and took Clara's hand. Clara's heart began to race and her cheeks flushed with heat that had nothing to do with the desert sun. Winona said simply that she had been alone for a long time and had believed she would remain alone forever. But Clara had changed that. Clara had changed everything. Clara wanted to pull away. Every lesson she had ever learned told her this was wrong, this was dangerous, this was something that could destroy them both. But she could not move. She could not speak. She could only sit there with Winona's warm hand in hers, feeling as if the ground beneath her had shifted and would never be solid again. When Winona leaned close and pressed her lips gently to Clara's cheek, Clara closed her eyes and felt tears slide down her face. She did not know if they were tears of joy or terror or both. That night, Clara lay awake in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of what had happened. She thought about her father and wondered what he would say if he could see her now. He had always encouraged her to follow her. Curiosity wherever it led. But surely he had never imagined it would lead her here. She thought about her aunt and the endless lectures about proper behavior and suitable matches. She thought about the town of Copper Springs and what would happen if anyone discovered the truth. But mostly she thought about Winona. She thought about the sound of her laughter and the grace of her movements and the way she looked at Clara as if Clara was the most remarkable person she had ever met. Clara had spent her entire life feeling like a puzzle piece that did not fit anywhere. Now she had found someone who made her feel complete, and she could not walk away from that, no matter the cost. The winter months brought cold nights and shorter days. Clara and Winona grew closer, stealing moments together whenever they could. They learned to be careful, to guard their expressions and their words when others were present. But in private they could be themselves. They could hold hands and share secrets and dream about a future that might never be possible. Spring arrived with wildflowers and renewed hope. Clara's students had made remarkable progress, and the parents of Copper Springs had begun to treat her with genuine respect. She received invitations to dinners and was asked her opinion on town matters. She had become a valued member of the community, and the thought of losing that position filled her with dread. Then disaster struck. A miner named Garrett Hutchins had been watching Clara more closely than she realized. He had noticed her early morning walks and her frequent visits to Winona's cabin. He was a bitter man who had been rejected by Clara when he made clumsy advances toward her during a town social. His wounded pride festered into something ugly, and he began to follow Clara, gathering evidence for accusations he planned to use against her. The confrontation came on a Sunday afternoon when most of the town had gathered for a church service Clara had excused herself from, claiming illness. She was with Winona in the small clearing they both loved, sitting close together and speaking in low voices. Garrett appeared suddenly from behind a cluster of rocks, his face twisted with triumph and malice. He called Clara terrible names and threatened to tell everyone what he had seen. He said she would be driven from town in disgrace and that Winona would suffer even worse consequences. Clara felt the world spinning around her. Everything she had built was crumbling before her eyes. But before she could speak, Winona rose to her feet and faced Garrett with a calm dignity that silenced his ranting. She told him that he could spread his poison if he chose, but that it would reflect more on his character than on theirs. She told him that love was never shameful regardless of what form it took. She told him that small men tried to destroy what they could not understand because it made them feel powerful. Garrett's face reddened with fury. He raised his hand as if to strike Winona, and Clara threw herself between them. She told Garrett that if he touched either of them, she would make certain everyone in town knew about the money he had been stealing from the mining company. She had seen his ledgers during a visit to the company office, and she had noticed the discrepancies. It was a bluff. She had seen nothing. But the fear that flashed across his face told her she had guessed correctly. Garrett lowered his hands slowly. He stared at both women with hatred burning in his eyes, but he did not speak again. He turned and walked away into the desert, leaving them standing together in the clearing. That night, Clara made a decision that would alter the course of her life. She went to Winona's cabin and told her that she wanted to leave Copper Springs. She wanted to find a place where they could live openly, without fear. Winona listened quietly and then asked if Clara truly understood what she was proposing. Such a place might not exist. They might search forever and never find it. Clara replied that she would rather spend her life searching beside Winona than stay safe and alone. They left Copper Springs 3 weeks later, after Clara had trained a young woman named Sarah to take over the school. She told the townspeople that she had received word of a family emergency back east and needed to leave immediately. Mayor Blackwood expressed genuine sorrow at her departure and pressed money into her hands that she tried to refuse. The children cried Andy begged her to stay. Clara hugged each one of them and promised to write letters that she knew she would never send. Clara and Winona traveled north into territories where fewer questions were asked and strangers were common. They found work where they could, Clara teaching and Winona selling her baskets and doing domestic work. They never stayed anywhere long enough to attract attention. They slept in boarding houses and abandoned cabins, and sometimes beneath the open sky with only blankets between them and the stars. Years passed, and they eventually found their way to a small town in Oregon, where the people were too busy surviving to worry much about the private lives of two quiet women who kept to themselves. They bought a small farm on the edge of town, and Clara opened a school in their front room. Winona planted a garden and raised chickens and learned to make cheese that she sold at the local market. They lived simply and peacefully, always careful but no longer afraid. Clara grew old with Winona beside her. Her hair turned white and her hands grew stiff with age, but her eyes remained sharp and curious. She never stopped sketching birds or pressing wildflowers or marveling at the beauty of the natural world. Winona aged gracefully, her dark hair streaked with silver, her movements slower but still elegant. They cared for each other through illnesses and losses and the quiet sorrows that came with growing old. When Clara died at the age of 76, Winona was holding her hand. Clara's last words were a whisper of thanks for the life they had shared, for the courage they had found together, for the love that had never wavered despite everything the world had thrown against it. Winona buried her beneath a willow tree on their property and planted wildflowers on the grave that bloomed every spring. The journal Clara had carried with her since leaving Boston was found among her belongings. It contained not only sketches of birds, but also a detailed account of her life, her love, and her journey. She had written it for anyone who might one day find themselves feeling like a puzzle piece that did not fit. She wanted them to know that there was always hope, always a place where they could belong, always someone who would see them for who they truly were and love them anyway. That was the gift Winona had given her, and it was the gift she hoped to pass on through the pages of her story.